Hello everyone and welcome back to the Second Party Podcast. Our episode today actually started out as a midnight musing at the end of an unreleased episode. We thought about it a little more and thought it was a topic that warranted an episode of its own, so this is exactly that. A few months ago, my family was together for just kind of a general family celebration. I think it was maybe a birthday, and my grandpa, my paternal grandfather, came over. A little ways into this get-together, I started hearing some stories from my grandpa, and one of them I had kind of heard before, as many people will tell some of the same stories multiple times, and this time I got a little bit more detail on it, and I found the story really interesting and thought it was kind of narratively relevant as well. The conversation got started when my grandpa was asking questions about guns and shooting, which has been kind of a newfound hobby of my father's and mine. We were talking about some of the times that we had gone gun shooting, and I asked my grandpa if he had ever been shooting before. He told me a story that I later remembered about him going out and shooting with a friend. His friend had a revolver that he had gotten and asked my grandpa if he wanted to go shoot it because he hadn't shot a gun at that point in his life. My grandpa said, sure, why not? This is back in the 60s, 70s, so laws, rules, and regulations surrounding things like this were substantially more lax than they are now. So my grandpa and his buddy went down the block and kind of went out over a field, and as my grandpa describes it, there were some power lines hanging above, and they were kind of shooting at bottles that were on the ground in the grass and whatnot, just having fun. When they saw a couple of birds fly down and land on the power lines. And my grandpa looked up at these birds, and as he describes, he said he thought that they were so beautiful, and he heard them kind of singing. So he described them to me as songbirds. And just out of curiosity, he said he kind of aimed the gun up and just pulled the trigger just to see what would happen, not thinking that he would hit these birds. And ultimately he did. Even though it was just one shot and he wasn't really trying to, he shot one of these birds, and he said that he just had this overwhelming sense of dread come over him, that he felt so bad for having shot one of these songbirds, and he felt terrible about it. It wasn't as if these birds were some endangered species or something like that, but he just felt so deeply saddened by this. It was a story that really stuck with me, and I think that that's because it's kind of an interesting story, not one that you would hear nowadays, but also I think it speaks to some greater truths. I think it's tough to tell with stories like this, especially when it's something that happened so long ago with somebody, whether they're literally true in a scientific type of sense, or if they're more narratively true, and that maybe it speaks to something deeper, and these memories have been exaggerated in some way, or
in hindsight you look back on a memory that's based in something that actually happened, but you have a different perspective on the time, so it's almost like the whole narrative or truth behind it seems to shift.
The reason I say that I think that this story that my grandpa told me is true in a way is because I think it is most definitely narratively true. So with my grandpa, at a pretty young age, he met and started dating my grandma, and they got married at kind of a very young age. They were together for a while, and they had my dad, and as is the case actually with almost all of my grandparents, a poor relationship with alcohol was one of the things that really resulted in a severe breakdown in their marriage, and ultimately ended up in divorce. All of my grandparents were divorced, so both of my parents were children of divorces, and I think it's something that really affected them as well as my grandparents. And I think that story, to me, perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but what I really see with that story that my grandpa tells me is somebody handing something dangerous to a young person to a young kid that they don't fully understand, and
haven't maybe thought through the ramifications of it.
yeah, they haven't thought through the ramifications, and well, things have gone fine with it up till this point, and I think one can be lulled into a false sense of security when some risk doesn't come to fruition, right? And that's what happened with my grandpa, right? They're shooting bottles, whatever. There's no problem at this point, and then he just kind of casually aims up and shoots a bird, and then he feels terrible about it. And I think, this lack of intentionality behind him shooting this bird, I think is, really kind of symbolic of how, especially at that time, and especially for my grandpas, many of my grandparents, their relationship with alcohol was. I don't think that these are people that fully grasped the potential ramifications of engaging in certain activities, and especially to the degree to which they did. And I think ultimately it resulted in this conclusion that they didn't necessarily anticipate, right? And I think it's almost even more poetic that these songbird types, these two lovebirds, these two songbirds, as my grandpa describes them, that's what ends up perishing here. It's kind of chillingly symbolic that a short time after this, my grandparents ended up getting divorced, and they were so young and happy and carefree before that, and something like alcohol, like that gun, comes in, and when it's given to someone who doesn't have that understanding, can really have severe ramifications. And I think just in general, that's one of those things where a lot of people are exposed to something like alcohol or tobacco or drugs or guns at a young age, and they're not really regulated or explained in a proper fashion to someone. And these are young people that don't have a risk-reward portion of their mind that is fully mature. When people are young, they are oftentimes impulsive and take large risks for small rewards, and that's because that portion of young people's brains is not fully developed yet.
I think the other sad or kind of chilling thing with your grandpa is, even now, like, he regularly laments the loss of that marriage. I think that's the impression I get.
Yeah, he's definitely
still
does.
grieving over it. I mean, however many years later, decades later,
and he still blames himself as well.
Yeah, and it's just talking to him, like, he looks back with tells stories from when they were married and when your dad was a little kid, like, very bittersweet and somberly, and it's
yeah, he really reminisces about it.
It's really quite sad.
Yeah, I think you hear so many stories of people at a young age getting involved in something that I don't think they understand the full ramifications of. In my grandfather's case, it's alcohol. In other people's cases, it's drugs or guns or tobacco or what have you, and these can have a profound effect on somebody's life, and it can destroy not only that person's life, but also the lives of other people and those around them as well. And I think that preserving a degree of freedom for people is obviously really critical. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that it's wrong to drink. I'm not saying it's a sin to drink. I'm not saying that we should make it illegal or anything like that. I actually recently had an interaction with somebody on Twitter surrounding essentially how one should legislate in America, and they posited that we should criminalize being drunk, and I don't think that we should do that, and I'm not necessarily even advocating for more stringent laws surrounding alcohol or other drugs or guns or any of that. I'm not advocating for that, but I do think that it's critical for everyone, especially young people, to take a good hard look at some of these decisions and understand the risks and rewards of them instead of simply looking at what's happening around you and going along with the flow.
Well, and these problems don't get solved with legislation either.
Yeah, these are problems that get solved on a social level, on an individual level, where each person makes a decision. I'm not saying that all of these things are doom and gloom. I'm not saying that one should just step away entirely. You know, I don't want to act like there's no reason to drink alcohol or any of these things. I do see a reason. Personally, I think in some cases, or many cases, the risks outweigh the rewards. I think there are two really drastically different sides of this. One where you've got people who are more liberally minded and just sit here and go, well, we can throw caution to the wind and it's totally fine, and why do we need to be, you know, the Debbie Downer and limit ourselves and things like that. And I don't think that that's the right approach. And but at the same time, you know, I think, for instance, with the mentality that, say, your grandparents take, right? I don't think that this is a tenable perspective
just
either.
that you should never, under any circumstance, have any alcohol.
Yeah, there was actually a funny instance where we were over at your house. I don't know if you remember this, but I was in the kitchen with your dad, and I think something came up where somebody mentioned having a glass of wine with something, and your grandmother kind of acted surprised at that, and then almost scolded your dad, who's
50.
He's like 50, right? Saying, "Oh, well, you should never drink. Like, that's terrible. That's wrong. That's a sin. You shouldn't do that." And funny enough, your dad's very agreeable, but in that instance, he looked at his mom, your grandma, and said,
"What are you talking about?
What are you talking about? Come on." That makes no sense. There's no reason to say that.
Jesus drank wine.
Yeah. And it's funny, your dad and your parents in general are not people to drink often, right?
No, they really don't.
Yeah.
It's just it's very rare if I see, maybe on very rare occasions, my dad will have some wine. But that's really it. Or my mom might have some fruity drink that, like, your mom made at a party or something.
Yeah, I think I could count on a hand or maybe two the number of times I've seen your parents drink ever. So
yeah,
I think when it comes to alcohol and drugs and guns and things like this, these are things that both the side that says, oh, well, you can just go do whatever with this, as well as the side that says, well, this is never good, never acceptable, you can never do anything with that. I think both of these sides are deeply flawed. I think what we need to do is have a realistic discussion on an individual level about the risks and rewards that come with these things and the extreme nature that they can bring with them, because oftentimes these things are deceiving.
Well, and there's a difference between advocating for people to have the liberty to do things and advocating for people to actually do those things.
Sure. You know, I think all of these things, though, have kind of an allure, actually. I think if you're denying the allure, that's actually a problem. I so often see people who come from these highly sheltered places or places where dissent is not allowed, and I hear things like, oh, well, there's no reason why anyone would ever want to drink. Or, I can't imagine why somebody would want to do drugs. And it's like, really? Really? Okay, let me describe something to you. What if you're sitting here and you're all uptight at a party and you just want to relax and have some fun and be able to let loose and talk openly with people, and you have a bit of a fun time and you have something to do with yourself, and there are people all around you and they're having drinks, and then you start thinking about the quintessential cowboy, man's man, in a movie who's got a cigar in one hand and a glass of scotch in the other, and look how burly and manly he is, and these women fawn after him. Or if you're a woman, oh, look at the breakfast at Tiffany's women with a cigarette in one hand and a martini in the other, and oh, look how all of the men fawn after her, and she's so seductive and sexual. Like, these are things that are compelling to people. Or, oh, you've got a very stressful life and you go to a 9-to-5 job, and don't you ever just want to be able to sit back and forget about the worries of the world and just get a little high and hang out and have a good laugh with your friends? These are things that are highly compelling to people. And I think that if you're denying that they're compelling, you're inadvertently giving these things not only a level of power over you, but over other people as well.
Well, I don't know that people are denying that they are compelling.
People do all the time in the highly restrictive, I would say generally religious, conservative communities that I see.
I don't know that it's so much that they're denying that they're compelling as much as that they're just like, these are taboo topics that we don't even talk about. Because they're worried that even talking about it is going to, like, you know, give someone too much information or have someone step over that line.
So, you said two things there that I thought were very interesting. The first is that they don't discuss something because they think that it may bring it to the forefront of someone's mind. I do think that that is a portion of it. I also think that there are plenty of people in these communities that don't see that as compelling at all and seek to deny it despite knowing the truth.
Yeah, I'm not saying that there aren't, but I just don't think that's the majority.
I think it's community dependent. I think there are some communities where it's a large portion. The second thing that I thought was really interesting that you said is these people think that if you were to give this information to someone, that they would be more likely and compelled to go do more of whatever that thing is.
Right.
What I think is deeply troubling about that, because I think that you're 100% right.
Mm-hmm.
What's deeply troubling about that is the truth does not hurt positions that are tenable. If you are holding a productive, tenable position and you are given the time and thought to be able to articulate that to someone fully, and you are actually correct.
Yeah.
The truth should only support your conclusion. If the truth, the actual truth, does not support your position, you have the wrong position.
Yeah, well, I think there's also, like, this idea in the back of people's mind of, well, we can't talk about these kind of things, or they're taboo, or they don't talk about them. Almost as if talking about them would, like, cause people to look into it more and then maybe branch out. Like, sheltering them protects them from that. Almost seems to imply that they do believe that, like, those things are so seductive that, like, if you even know about it.
Sure.
Like, that seems at conflict with the idea that these things aren't really that much of a problem, or there isn't an allure to it. Because if there wasn't, then why would you be afraid about talking about it? So
two things can be true at once. These people can subconsciously know that there is an allure to something, and they can consciously deny that there is an allure and have, as Orwell describes, doublethink.
Mm-hmm.
And say, oh, well, there certainly isn't an allure to this thing.
Yeah.
And deny that. And I think, ultimately, the best antidote and protection to something is having knowledge and being informed about that thing. The best thing you can do for a child to protect them against something is not to stand in the way of that child ever being exposed to that thing. It's to voluntarily expose that child to the thing in initially a controlled setting so that they get used to that thing, and then they're able to go out and tackle that themselves and survive it. Now, I'm not saying, and I want to be clear, I'm not advocating that we go throw a gun in a 3-year-old's hand and have them figure it out.
Obviously, you need to use judgment about when it's appropriate to introduce certain ideas or
and I'm not saying
pieces of information to children, but
I'm not saying to start teaching kids how to drink at the age of 10, okay? But I do think...
Well, should you ever teach kids how to drink? Like, what do you mean, teach how to drink? I guess my point is talking about alcohol with your kids, or the positives, negatives of alcohol, being truthful and transparent around it doesn't mean you need to be like teaching your kids how to go get drunk.
Yeah, but I do think, so let's take alcohol for example, because we've been talking about that a fair amount here. If we look at something like that, I do think that it's actually a serious issue what we have as the drinking age. So, first off, many other people have brought this up before, but the fact that we will draft people and send them off to war at 18, while simultaneously saying to them, oh, for 3 years, you can't have a drink, this is ludicrous, okay? The other thing that I don't think is highlighted enough is that what I was describing earlier, where somebody knowledgeable, a parent, walks a child or somebody who's not yet knowledgeable about something through how to use that thing. I think there's a serious problem when we sit back and we say, you get to start drinking at 21. Well, what usually is occurring at 21? Usually people are...
You're in college.
Out of the house to some degree. So whether that's they're off renting, they've got a job, they're going to community college, they're in their 4-year degree, okay? And these people are now being introduced to alcohol for the first time, if they've not already been, by the way, which is often the case.
Often, maybe at 18 when you go off to college, or depending on where you are, maybe even at high school.
But in either case, what we have is children being introduced to alcohol with nobody to guide them. Whether that's because they're now out of their parents' house, or freshly, might I add, or they're doing so illegally and now not bringing parents into it because they're underage drinking. In either case, we've removed a guiding role model from the equation. If instead, and I'm not necessarily advocating for this to be the case, if instead the drinking age was 17 or 18, and what you had was kids being exposed to this, yes, slightly younger, but under the at least relative supervision of a parental figure, I feel like this would result in a much healthier relationship with some of these substances. I think it would result in having a discussion about these substances. Speaking of which, I think the discussion would go something like, yes, this is very alluring, and yes, I recognize that there are a lot of compelling things about this, but let's also talk about the negatives. For instance, the issues that I've seen with my extended family. One would talk to their kids about the severity that one should treat this with. Whether it comes to crimes or violent activities where almost 48% of homicide offenders drank right before a murder occurred, right? That's a large percentage. Or if we're simply talking about a lack of control of oneself, especially in an adolescent age, where you've got large numbers of kids who don't totally know how to control themselves, and now you put them even less in control because you've introduced alcohol into the equation, you could just be in the wrong place with something. We've got issues with drunk driving. We've got issues with potential sexual assault allegations or potential sexual assault. We have issues with kids not understanding what their alcohol tolerance level is. And this applies to not just alcohol, but other drugs as well. It applies to guns. These are things that people need to be walked through. And I think that each one of these is approached in a bit of a different way. Personally, I think one of the better approaches that we have is with that of guns. I think that many people who are introduced to guns at a young age do so with a parent who is very involved. They do so in a safe manner. And I think that there's kind of a community that comes around that advocates for safety, and it's something that we advocate for on a generalized level. And that's not something that I see with alcohol, drugs, smoking, things like this.
Yeah, I do think the people who are like gun people are generally pretty good about that from what I've seen in my own personal experience. I know I've said this to you before, but I didn't like grow up around guns at all. My parents were not gun people by any means. Mm-hmm. My grandpa was into hunting, and he was kind of like a gun guy, but it's not like that we necessarily did a lot with that. He took us shooting once, but mm-hmm. So I was always just a little bit more leery around guns, not super comfortable.
Sure.
Until we started going shooting with, one of your friends who's very much avid gun owner kind of guy, and has membership at a range and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And we started going there, and like the thing that was most comforting to me was seeing how seriously people take the responsibility that you must have when you are handling firearms.
Yeah, and it's very ingrained. I'm sure you can find examples where this isn't the case, but from what I've observed, it's very, very ingrained in that culture. Whether it's at a range, whether you're talking to people about it, or you're purchasing a firearm, the safety element of these things, mm-hmm. people are very excited about it, and people have a passion and a love for it, but there's a very diligent level of safety that's always emphasized.
And I mean, I would also use the word like discipline too. Like, it is very important that you strictly follow proper general practices mm-hmm. for handling firearms, being around people. Like, I remember, even though I didn't have a lot of exposure to guns when I was a kid, the little that I did have with my grandpa, I remember just him very much like, you need to understand the mm-hmm. most important thing is every single gun is always loaded at all times. That's how you treat it.
Yeah. And
you never point a gun at anyone. Mm-hmm. I don't care if it's I don't care if with 100% certainty there's nothing in it, there's no mag in it.
You never know with 100%
right,
certainty.
Yeah, I know. But I don't care. You do not point a gun at someone.
Unless you're going to shoot them.
Unless you have intent to shoot someone, which of course you should only be doing in a dire type of situation. So I remember that being very much ingrained in me, and that like people who are in, I guess if you want to call it the gun community, are very serious about that. Mm-hmm. They don't mess around with stuff like that. And like for me, going to a gun range and seeing the seriousness with which people treat it mm-hmm. helped me feel a lot more comfortable, because I got a sense of like, I know how to like handle this mm-hmm. and I have a level of confidence that the people around me also know how to handle it. And mm-hmm. we, as in broader we, this community as a society, we treat this very seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look at something like the culture that I've been exposed to, at least, surrounding firearms, the emphasis on safety and things like that, I think is what allows me to feel comfortable enough to engage in the activity. There's always a level of lack of comfortability that there will be surrounding that because of the dangerous aspect to it. And by the way, I think that that should remain. I think that there should be a lack of comfortability when you get behind the wheel of a car. Like that,
Right.
you are in control of something that is very powerful, and making sure that you properly exercise that control is something very critical. When we contrast this, in my opinion, with the communities surrounding and events that involve alcohol or drugs and things like this, these are not places where I feel like safety and security and mitigating and eliminating risk as much as we can are exercised. When I look at something like a typical bar scene, okay, I'm not saying that it's like there are a bunch of loaded weapons and people are swinging them around like we're in the Wild West. I'm not saying that, but I've seen far too many times someone who is clearly intoxicated to a high degree and they're not being taken care of. And when I say that, I mean from two sides. One is that we need to be protecting other people from them, and we need to be protecting them from themselves. And I don't see a lot of that being emphasized in, like the bar scene or situations that involve alcohol. I don't see that around the drug and tobacco side of things. I don't see people saying things like, okay, well, let's be really thoughtful about this. I feel like oftentimes they're playing fast and loose with things. And that, at least for me, is why I choose not to engage in drinking alcohol and doing drugs and in smoking and things like this, because I don't feel like it's well regulated, on top of the fact that I think that it comes with a number of other risks.
Yeah. Well, and I think if I understand what you're saying, it's basically like the solution to that is not to just try and shelter your kids so that they never have to confront that, because they are going to have to confront that most likely at some point in their life.
Yeah.
Right? That those temptations or potential risks or things that could easily, go sideways if not handled properly, they are going to confront that one way or another. So why would you send, your adolescent child out into the world without any knowledge of that?
Yeah, I think that we need to do a better job of teaching kids. I think in an ideal world that would be done by the parents. Most people send kids off to a school. I think that this would be a great environment to have these conversations, provided parents are approving of this. Personally, I think that from the gun side of things, I think that an even better job could be done surrounding gun safety, because one of the biggest holes that I see is a severe division between people who are gun owners, Second Amendment supporters, things like that. Is those people get a level of understanding and training and knowledge on that topic, but oftentimes those who are not necessarily exposed to that at home, or those whose parents are not aware of that, don't get exposed to it. And just because there's not a gun in your house doesn't mean that you're not going to be exposed to this. So I think that schools could do a better job educating children on gun safety. And I also think that while, in my experience at least, there's some level of discussion surrounding drugs and alcohol and things like that, oftentimes that discussion looks something more like, here are all the terrible things with this, here are all the ways that it could be bad, and you should not do this. And oftentimes that falls on deaf ears, especially with children who are looking to have some fun or thrill in their lives. And I'm not saying that schools should be advocating for this, And I most definitely think, I want to reiterate this, that parents should be kept in the loop with this, and parents would be the ideal people to have these discussions. But I also think that we should take a step back and acknowledge the reality of things, that most people don't just throw drinking out the window, and that we should have a realistic discussion about this where we talk about positives, we talk about the compelling nature or allure of something, and we also talk about the severe risks and negatives that can result from these things, because they can be very extreme.
Yeah. Well, and the thing with guns, like if you didn't have any knowledge or experience with guns, and basically what you knew was, well, they can be very dangerous and they can be used to kill people, and yikes.
Yeah, you're gonna be terrified.
We shouldn't have these in society. Like, this is a horrible idea. Like, if that's all you knew, I can understand how that's the conclusion you'd come to.
Yeah. Well, the same thing could be said for, say, alcohol or drugs, where you sit here and go, if you've never had anyone drinking around you, you could get very concerned if somebody's having one beer. These are not things that should, if you're informed about them, be terribly alarming.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that means that you don't obviously try and have your guard up, because the reality is not everyone does know how to handle those things properly. So
I agree.
Yeah, you could be around someone at a bar who, like, they could become a danger. So you need to be aware. But yeah, I think another thing kind of like this, with talking to kids about and educating adolescents about this before sending them off into the real world, is with money. How to properly handle money. I don't know that people really get that education, and so money can be abused. It's very often, people go into debt, crazy amounts of debt, because they've never learned how to properly handle money, or, people come across a large amount of money by one means or another, if they were never taught how to handle it. And all of a sudden now they're an adult, they're actually, maybe making some money, and they never learned how to handle that, then they can make some really bad decisions that could really destroy their life.
When I think about exposing kids to things, I vividly remember multiple instances where I'd be walking with my dad, going off to, I don't know, like a dance recital of my sister's or something like that. And my dad would intentionally park a bit farther away from wherever we were going so that we could walk there. And he would walk with me, and he'd kind of probe me and ask, okay, look around you. What do you see? What do you observe? And how does that inform the decisions that we make and how we carry ourselves? And there were many instances where I looked around and I went, oh, geez, I'm not really comfortable here. I'm a little...
You're in a bad part of town.
Yeah, I'm a little leery. And my dad would look at me and he'd explain that, actually, we're in a totally fine part of town. Here are things that you can look for. And yes, this, and this may be concerning to you because you don't see this all the time. But the reality is that this is more fine than you're thinking about. It's different from what you normally see. And then other times I would feel very comfortable with something, and my dad would point things out and explain to me and go, okay, actually these couple of things are indicative of being in not the greatest part of town, and you should be thoughtful when we're seeing needles on the ground or something like that. And like, these are things that we take note of and be thoughtful about. And, I think that level of education and seeing things and having somebody talk them through with you, instead of just saying, oh, well, never walk in a bad part of town. Well, what if you find yourself in a bad part of town, or you didn't think that this was a bad part of town initially and you ended up there? Or if you're in a city that you've never been before, how are you supposed to look around and understand your surroundings so that you can act appropriately, right? If we're in a great part of town, we can go on a lovely stroll and say hi to people and what have you. If we're in not a great part of town, let's be thoughtful about walking intentionally and briskly, and not directly engaging with people often, things like that. I think that adding information is really what sets people free in things like this.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that as parents also, part of your job is trying to figure out the best ways to teach your children about certain things, and that can differ child to child.
Yeah, but I think no matter what, you should have discussions about these things, and the more information that you're able to
at an appropriate
give,
age, right?
Yes, obviously. But what I oftentimes see is people going off to college, let's say, and now all of a sudden they're confronted with alcohol or drugs.
Yeah. Well, like
and they have no knowledge of this.
We knew your freshman year roommate.
Yeah.
From high school, and I think he grew up in a pretty.
He grew up very sheltered. Yeah.
Yeah. And just went off to college and made all sorts of decisions that made that first year you two trying to live together really difficult.
Yeah, I would say that they were pretty risky decisions given what he was used to, and in my estimation he did not have a full understanding of the risks involved in some of the activities he was partaking in, like, for example, drinking alcohol, and I don't think that there was an understanding of these things going into it, and then he ended up, from my understanding at least, needing to kind of learn the hard way with some of these things.
I mean, I think he has since come to recognize a lot of that. Like,
yeah, I think that's great.
Recently.
It's wonderful, yeah.
So, yeah, but that's one way to learn, I guess. But that's a hell of a risky way to kind of try and live your life, is just, well, let me just try and figure it out as I get to it. Like, yeah, maybe, hopefully that'll work, maybe. But not always. Like, not everyone rebounds from these kind of and not that he was, like, the worst out there or anything like that. But,
no, not at all.
But people go off and make decisions, and sometimes people rebound from them, and sometimes they get caught with, even if they can learn from it, they still get caught with having to pay consequences for their actions for the rest of their life.
Yeah, I think the analogy I'd maybe give is, like, you can allow your kid to just dive in the deep end and hope that they can keep afloat and survive and whatnot. Or when they're young, you can take them into a pool and you can toss them around in the water, and you can help them learn how to swim, and you can teach them how to hold their breath, and you can walk them through classes, and we can swim in the shallow end and then graduate to the deep end, and make thoughtful choices instead of just...
I mean, I think the real question, trying to figure out what does that actually look like for all these different lessons in life, like, practically speaking, right? Like, you're not going to give your 12-year-old two cans of beer to help them figure out what it is like to be tipsy or something.
Yeah, but when I was 12, my dad already started talking to me about, hey, look, son, I am your dad. I am this tall at this weight. I'm having 2 beers. That's totally fine for me. I feel fine. I can go throw a baseball with you outside. If I was a 90-pound woman who never drinks, this would look very differently. And my dad at the age of 12, 13, 14 was already having conversations like that with me. And obviously a conversation with a 12-year-old is much more high level, where we're just talking, hey, alcohol affects people differently based on tolerance level and size and weight and things like this, than an 18-year-old, where we're talking about what does alcohol content look like?
Yeah,
here's what these certain feelings are, and how to handle ourselves.
I get it. I'm just saying that that's the actual, like, tricky part, I think, where you try to figure out, practically speaking, how do you teach lessons to your kids, and at what ages is it appropriate to do what, and how do you try to ingrain the lesson as best as you can. Because also, like I said, it could differ from child to child. Like, certain children could receive a lesson in one way, and maybe that doesn't resonate with another one. But I guess that's just your job as a parent. Like, definitely not an easy job, I'm sure. I mean, I haven't been a parent yet, but I can imagine.
I guess in conclusion, what I'd maybe say is, if you're a parent, I would suggest starting those conversations early. I think that knowledge and strengthening your children against things is the best way to actually protect them in the long term. And for those that are not children or don't have children right now, I would encourage you to reassess some things that perhaps you haven't in a number of years. There are many activities, I think, that carry a risk level with them, and we can be lulled into a false sense of security when, for a long time in our lives, we've not had to experience any of the negative effects of those risks. But they can come to bear slowly, like they did for my grandpa, or they could come to bear all at one time, and you've simply skirted around it for the time being. In either case, I think that really taking a look at some of these higher risk activities and thinking critically about them is beneficial to everyone. Well, it's getting late now, but I've been thinking recently a little bit about what habits I have on a day-to-day basis. A few weeks ago, I came down with a bit of a sickness, and it gave me a bit of time to reflect, and I was looking back on some of the things I had done in the past year or so, and I thought to myself, did I make the most of every day out there? I wrote something down, being a little bit like self-critical and self-reflective, something that I was trying to ask myself. I wrote, are you going to engineer your life and act like an adult and show some level of self-control? Or are you going to let off on the gas and leave greatness by the wayside and allow people to pass you? What are you going to do every day? Write that down. Hold yourself accountable. Give yourself permission to mess up, but not to fail entirely. That's something I've been thinking about more recently. I'm trying to assess some of those daily habits and really make the most out of each day. Something that we can all always get better at. Maybe we'll do a podcast on habits a bit later, but I think I need to do some more reflection on that point in my life and hone that a little bit more to be able to speak on it a bit more clearly. With that, it's getting late. Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for your time. If there are any topics that you'd like to hear us talk about, or any comments, questions, feel free to send us an email at secondpartypodcast@gmail.com. Again, we'd love to get any recordings of comments you guys have or topic ideas. We'd love to feature those on the podcast if that can be well integrated. Thank you again, and have a good night.